Thank you. Good evening, everyone. We're continuing with our wonderful adventure through this book, In Divine Friendship, which is personal letters and a few sort of public letters that Swami wrote. And it's been really a great adventure. So we also, Keshav here tonight. We're also going to chant a little and meditate a little before we start. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence, to be ever aware that you are always with us. Open our hearts and open our minds in joyful expectancy, in total receptivity, that we may conduct our lives in harmony with your will and find in that harmony the divine love and joy we are seeking. Om. Peace. Amen.
Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. In the forest thou art green, in the forest thou art green, in the mountain thou art high, in the mountain thou art high, in the river thou art restless, in the river thou art restless, in the ocean thou art grave, in the ocean thou art grave. O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful. At thy feet, O I do bow, at thy feet, O I do bow. O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful. To the serviceful thou art service, to the serviceful thou art service, to the lover thou art love, to the lover thou art love, to the sorrowful thou art sympathy, to the sorrowful thou art sympathy, to the yogi thou art bliss, to the yogi thou art bliss. O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful. At thy feet, O I do bow, at thy feet, O I do bow. O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful, O God, beautiful. In the forest thou art green, in the forest thou art green, in the mountain thou art high, in the mountain thou art high, in the river thou art restless, in the river thou art restless, in the ocean thou art grave, in the ocean thou art grave. beautiful, oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. To the serviceful thou art service. To the serviceful thou art service. To the lover thou art love. To the lover thou art love. To the sorrowful thou art sympathy. To the sorrowful thou art sympathy. To the yogi thou art bliss. To the yogi thou art bliss. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. In the forest thou art green. In the forest thou art green. In the mountain thou art high. In the mountain thou art high. In the river thou art restless. In the river thou art restless. In the ocean thou art grave. In the ocean thou art grave. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. At thy feet, oh, I do bow. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. To the serviceful thou art service. To the serviceful thou art service. To the lover thou art love. To the lover thou art love. To the sorrowful thou art sympathy. To the sorrowful thou art sympathy. To the yogi thou art bliss. To the yogi thou art bliss. Oh God, beautiful, oh God, beautiful. 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 Who is in my temple? Who is in my temple? All the doors do open themselves. All the lights do light themselves. All the doors do open themselves. All the lights do light themselves. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh, flies away. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh, flies away. Who flies away. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away. Who is in my temple? Who is in my temple? All the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves, all the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away. Who is in my temple? Who is in my temple? All the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves, all the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away. Who is in my temple? Who is in my temple? All the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves, all the doors do open themselves, all the lights do light themselves. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away. Darkness like a dark bird flies away, oh flies away.
Om, peace. Amen. Okay, my friends, this evening we're going to be, and I don't even think we'll get through the whole thing. We are in August 2nd, 1998. And the letter is called Thoughts. Let me see, does the letter have a name? It doesn't really. Oh, we've changed sections. We've now finished the whole section called Ananda, and we're now in the section called Chanting. And this whole section is primarily this one letter, which is 2, 4, 6, 8 pages, 7 pages. 8 pages, and then a few comments about it. Okay, so what this letter is about, it's famous. It's the famous chanting letter that those of us who lived through it in 1998, which was now like more than 20 years ago. It was a necessary corrective that Swami felt he needed to issue because he felt the way that we were chanting, and especially the plethora, the growing inclination to sing a lot of Indian chants, was not consistent with what Master wanted. And it was it was not in the natural flow because a lot of us had a lot of energy going in another way. Here in Palo Alto, our Friday kirtans were a really big event every week. A wonderful man named Raghu was living here at the time, and he had a big, powerful voice and a big, powerful presence, and we had lots of harmoniums and lots of guitars and drums and bells, and we'd just sit down and chant for like 2 hours. And we did a lot of Indian chants, and we did just a tiny bit of meditation during the chanting session. And it was some, I think I want to use the word samskar. It was some memory of some other lifetime. And so it was very enjoyable. It was also very rajasic. Rajasic means just had a lot of energy, but energy that dynamic, moving. It wasn't deeply. Well, it's a funny thing because it was very inspiring. But as you'll hear from the discussion Swami had, it wasn't exactly what Master had brought us here to do. So I remember this letter vividly because we had to sort of slightly redirect what we were doing, and it wasn't an easy transition. Okay, the following letter and statement, thoughts on chanting, were sent to Ananda leaders and musicians. A section of this letter is addressed specifically to the Ananda leaders in Australia, because they really had a very different style of chanting. So, August 2nd, 1998. Dear ones, I'm attaching a few thoughts I've just written on chanting. I'd appreciate feedback from you, and I suggest you share this attachment with others, especially those who are involved in leading chanting. Why did he put it like that? Maybe he was sending us a manuscript or something like that, and he'd attached it to something else. It's a little confusing. Okay, so first it starts, Dear ones in Australia. So this is like a whole different issue than just chanting once we start into the Australia thing. I've been hoping to hear from you. Let me just sort of give you a context about Australia. There were two couples, eventually three couples, that ended up doing work in Australia. The original couple, the man was from Australia and had always wanted to try to establish Ananda there. Swami always had in his mind that we would establish a work in Australia, and I don't know if it's in this book or not, but he felt that the Australians were still too rebellious for a path as discipleship-oriented as ours. Whether or not it's true, or the original residents of Australia, the English-speaking colony, not the native people. The English-speaking colony was created out of people who were exiled there for transgressions against the law. And those are, outlaw types, rebellious types, don't tell me what to do types. And that's still a bit of the Australian spirit. And even though Swami went there on several occasions before we tried to establish a permanent work there, he just never felt like the whole country was quite, even the devotees, he just never felt like the devotees had really, were really collectively in a position to really build an Ananda work. That was in the 80s, so we're talking 35 or 40 years, so part of my unfinished business in my own mind, when I have had to decide what to do next. I've tried to look for unfinished business, and Australia's sort of unfinished Ananda business. So I was trying again to see if I could travel to Australia just before the COVID hit. So I tried to go to Australia about 5 years ago, and I couldn't. There just wasn't enough there for me to land. I'm not an evangelical who'll just feel told by God to go somewhere and just walk there without knowing anyone. I need to have a host and something to hold it. So I did find wonderful host in New Zealand and went there instead, but I never got to Australia. So where am I going with all of this? Oh, it's sort of unfinished business, because Swami always had visualized our doing something in Australia. And that same independent spirit when it can be harmonized with discipleship, can be very, very strong spiritually and very Ananda-like. So it's sort of there to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. So this couple, this Australian man, just really felt a calling to go back. So he and his wife and daughter and another couple and their children, they went to Australia to see what they could establish. And immediately, maybe it was just the influence of the water and the air, the soil, but this sort of independent streak began to manifest among the four of them. And it wasn't that they were rebelling against anything, or being hindered, but they began to have a very strong self-determined streak that somehow it just became a bit of an issue. I wasn't closely involved in it, so I can't speak to it too exactly, but they were just determined to be able to do it the way they felt it should be done. And so that's what Swami's addressing here. And among other things, especially one of the women of the four had a very strong feeling about chanting and was very inclined toward a certain style of chanting, which was a lot of Indian chants and sung in a certain way with a certain spirit. And it was precisely what Swami was feeling was not really what he wanted, not the direction he wanted Ananda to go. So this letter that follows, he knew would not be very welcomed by them, and especially by her. But he also felt that they had made it clear that they wanted to be guided in their own way, to do it in their own way. And they were self-supporting. It wasn't like, they had gone on behalf of Ananda, and I'm sure there was some financial support, but not very much. Mainly they were making a work in the way that they felt it ought to be made. And if they didn't invite Swamiji's close direction of what they were doing, then he certainly wasn't going to impose it on them. It was, if you were receptive and invitational, Swamiji would give you everything he could. But if you said, I'd rather do it myself, he would say, fine. In this particular setting, because one, they were thousands of miles away, and also they'd made the point. So anyway, so now we start in Australia. Dear ones in Australia, I've been hoping to hear from you. I want to say part of the problem was they rarely communicated with him. So it was often like, how can I help you if you don't even talk to me? I've been hoping to hear from you. I want to say that none of this in the letter that follows is intended to force you into a different direction from what you yourselves feel to go. If my ideas don't inspire you, then please do what does inspire. Just as simple as that. There have been a few questions about some of your directions, the thought being that they don't seem to be the way we do things elsewhere. I love the way, see how careful Swami phrases that? What you're doing doesn't seem to be the way we're doing things in other places. He could have said that in so many different ways. What you're doing doesn't seem in tune, what you're doing doesn't seem to represent Ananda, what you're doing isn't what Master wants. But he just said, what you're doing is not the way we do things elsewhere. So it's just like, it's about as simple and light a statement, but he says, nonetheless, you're charting your own course. But I realize that Ananda will grow in many directions, and I don't want to discourage a tendency that is inevitable anyway. I do very much hope that our core, meaning that Ananda will grow in many ways. He says, Swami was so realistic, and his realism, he always would just say, he always knew that you could never make it exactly perfect, so you would just make things as good as you could. Many times leaders just get very confused because they try so hard to make it exactly the way they want it that nothing ever really happens. So Swami says, inevitably, as time passes, Ananda will grow in many different directions. That which, was the essential beginning, it'll just, by people's initiative and their own inspiration and the mere passage of time and moving thousands of miles away. So he says, Swami says, I don't want to discourage a tendency that is inevitable anyway. There's no point in fighting against destiny. I do very much hope that our core colonies, those on America's west coast, will maintain their closeness to Master's spirit and way of doing things as I've tried to teach them. So he hits both sides of it. I don't want to discourage something that's going to happen anyway, but I do hope that there will be a center point of Ananda that will be reflective of the way Swamiji envisions it should be. And he goes so far as to say it, Master's spirit. But I know that many other colonies will spring up, and that while most, perhaps, will be inspired by Ananda, not all of them will do things just as they are done in those core colonies. They'll be inspired by Ananda, but they won't be exactly the same. Some will be different in certain ways, perhaps even in many ways. If you yourselves want to do things as much as possible the way we do them in America and in Italy, my own energy will certainly go out more toward you. But I, and I think I speak for all of us, will support you in whatever ways we can in any case. We know you are working sincerely and with devotion, and I bless you for your courage in trying to establish a work there, which is, I know, a great challenge for you. So we'll help you more if you want our help, and the way you show you want our help is by the fact that you communicate and you try to model yourself after what's going on elsewhere. If you redefine the work according to your own inspiration, Swami's not criticizing it. He's just saying that doesn't leave much place for his input. If my letter seems critical of you in any way, then please do me the kindness of giving me reassurance, especially on the points I've raised here. Remember, we have another half a page here before he starts talking about the chanting. Remember, I haven't heard from you. How can I know anything if you don't write? But this letter hasn't been written to criticize, because I never want to tell you what to do in anything. How you lead things there is your decision. My love is with you in any case. To the rest of you, there is another point. So now he's finished talking to the Australians. He's just giving them to 3 Americans and 1 Australian were there representing Ananda. We never succeeded in establishing an Ananda work there. Another couple went over later for a year or 2. He was a New Zealander, she an American. And we sort of worked on it, but it just never took hold. One of the original 2 couples, though, actually settled in Australia and have a yoga center and continued to be Master's disciples, and from all accounts have done very good work. It doesn't have Ananda's name on it, but there's no reason why it needs to. It's very good work for Master and more satisfying for them because of the freedom that they have to do things as they feel inwardly inspired. So the net result of all of that was that Ananda still doesn't have, let me phrase it differently. There is an Ananda group there, a meditation group, and there's devotees there, but we haven't been able to start a community or really establish a church, a sangha or anything there yet. That's all, yet. So now Swami's done addressing the four friends in Australia, and now he says, to the rest of you, there is another point that I might have raised in the attached letter, but felt it better to limit it for now to this, what I've written here. It is this: We don't consider appointments to the ministry from a standpoint of people's desire to teach, but rather from their humility and worthiness to do so. Shouldn't we do that also, at least to some extent, with the music ministry? To let people lead chanting only because they desire to, and to turn the job over to them without seeing to it that they get proper training, could in time prove disastrous, is what he says. It seems wiser to have fewer people leading the group chants than, if we want more chant leaders, not to take them off the street, so to speak, newcomers in other words, but to give them adequate preparation for such a service. The music is treated all too often as though it were a minor aspect of what we do. It is, however, in fact, central to everything we do. This is something that Swami talked about in an earlier letter when he was talking about his creative team. So, I guess in various parts of Ananda, the chanting was treated more casually than Swami thought it should be. So now this is Thoughts on Chanting by Swami Kriyananda. When I first encouraged chanting with guitars, it was over 15 years ago. I've just stopped for a minute. It was in the early 80s. And a few people had always chanted with guitars because there were people who came to Ananda playing the guitar, and the guitar is a natural instrument to accompany singing. So it was there were a few people who chanted with guitars, but Swami, even though he played the guitar and would accompany himself when he was singing the songs he'd written, he only ever did chants with the harmonium. And the way that we chanted was always with the harmonium because that's how Master did it. And then Swami's going to talk about this. He met this group in Italy, Pecchi it was called, and they did a lot of singing and chanting with guitars. And that Swami appreciated the way they did it, and it brought it to his consciousness that perhaps it was something he should give more attention to and perhaps bring into the Ananda way. He hesitated because Master chanted with the harmonium, not with the guitar. And Swami is exceedingly sensitive to the nuances of music, and so that's what he's talking about. When I first encouraged chanting with guitars, it was over 15 years ago, I did it because much of our chanting lacked the energy that rhythm gives to a chant. Rhythm is not so important for personal chanting. Master would hold a single note for a long time, sometimes when chanting with only 2 or 3 of us. But it is important when chanting in a bigger group. Lacking this sense of rhythm, I found that the chants were getting slower and slower, until by the end they sometimes sounded positively funereal. Maybe it was simply the time it takes for sound to travel between the front and the back of a large room. But in fact, I think it was more than that. When leading the chanting, my own playing would get dragged slower and slower. The only alternative would have been to accept a battle of wills between my playing and what was coming back to me from the audience. We had a few Indian drums that people tended to thump, rather like American Indian tom-toms. The sound lowered the vibration of the chanting instead of raising it. The inability of Americans to tune into the subtlety of Indian chanting became especially evident to me at gatherings in Hare Krishna temples, the Hare Krishna movement in America. When Swami lived in San Francisco in the 60s, he would sometimes go to the Hare Krishna temple because Prabhupada, the founder of that movement, an Indian man, was still living, and he lived there, and Swami was very nostalgic for India, and he would go and see Prabhupada, and they would talk Bengali together, and he would enjoy that. So he said, it became evident to me at gatherings of Hare Krishna temples, where I found the beat was sometimes of a lower chakra variety that affected even the movements the people made while dancing. Again, in those temples, I was sometimes reminded of war dances around a tribal fire. Swami's nothing if not frank sometimes. So it occurred to me that guitar playing could help solve our problems. I'd heard this at Pecchi, a spiritual group in Italy, and realized that guitar playing was something Westerners were better at. At Pecchi, it gave a more uplifting power to the chanting. The same thing, I thought, could influence our own chanting and rescue it from becoming a sort of hymn sing. In fact, the guitars give a certain power to the rhythm. I think they've added a lot to our chanting overall. That phrase about the chants becoming like hymns, that's not so good either. As you can see, he's trying to thread a needle here. And it's also interesting, like everyone else is thinking, oh yeah, we'll just pick up a guitar, we'll start playing it. But Swami spent a long time really thinking it through because everything that Swami himself did, and Ananda by extension, becomes the definition of Master's work. And if Master never did use guitars in something as important as our chanting, which is really fundamental, it is really part of our sadhana. There's lots of things that we do that we don't pretend are sadhana. So it doesn't really matter so much. But chanting, Master called it half the battle of the spiritual life. Chanting is just really central to our sadhana. So anything Swami did that caused it to deviate from the example Master set, it wasn't peripheral. It wasn't like taking something and then creatively expanding outward and finding a new way to express it. I mean, the whole education for life, has been created by the intuition of a lot of people who are doing it, because Master left only a little bit in place. But chanting is not that category. Master wrote chants, Master chanted himself, Master encouraged us to chant, and then he showed us a certain way to do it. So it's very important. Whenever Swami's really innovated in any way, he's always done it after very long and very careful consideration. So, then there was also the element of chords. Up to a point, chords were helpful, for they stirred up feeling in the heart. Swami just tells us, chords stir up feeling in the heart. I remember Master during the chanting at one Christmas meditation encouraging us to whip up the feeling of the heart. But I've worried also about these changes. For one thing, to stir the emotions at the beginning of a chanting session can be helpful, but later on the emotions must be transformed into intuitive feeling, which is always calm and interiorized. How to effect this transformation? That's one way to put it. And, well, I guess, Swami, I'm going to get ahead and say things, but Swami talks about how, as Westerners, we're very used to emotional music. So we like emotional music. We like music that just stirs up the heart and gives us a lot of feeling. But it's very, very subtle, because, of course, you want to stir up the feelings of the heart. That's what Master said, whip up the feelings of the heart. But you don't want it to go into emotional a direction. Chords stir up the feeling, but you don't want them to go emotional. I had a very interesting, really vivid experience of the difference between the music, chanting, of course, and the songs that Swami writes, and the music that most people think of as popular and attractive. I moved to Ananda in 1971, Ananda village, which was quite sequestered at that point, and I've never been very interested in popular culture, and I've just never paid that much attention. And I was living very isolated. So even though I heard here and there about Barbra Streisand, who was a very popular singer at that time, I realize now, a generation later, people don't even know the name. But she was she's still living, extraordinarily talented and very good at what she did, and became very, very popular. But I'd never heard her sing, just because it had never come up. And when I started traveling and lecturing, and I was in some city somewhere, Seattle perhaps, or Portland, and a movie had come out that Barbra Streisand was the star of. It was called Yentl. So it was even a film about Jewish life. She was a matchmaker, and no, she wasn't a matchmaker. It was a woman, and the film was a woman who wanted to study, and so disguised herself as a man so she could study, because it was set in the 1800s or maybe even the 1700s. And as a woman, she wasn't allowed to study, but she really wanted to study. So she disguised herself as a man, and the disguise worked so well and got carried away that the rabbi who was the head of the yeshiva where she was studying married her to his daughter. And this was not a story about same-sex unions. This was a story, and this was not a transgender person. This is a woman who was disguised as a man so she could study. And she ends up, in this crazy situation. And it was parts of it were comical, but it was also a very heartfelt movie. And eventually she's discovered, and so she has to leave for the new world. That's how the movie ends. And she's on a ship, she's crossing the ocean from Europe to the new land of America, where everyone is free and she can do what she wants. But the movie is filled with music, and she sings a great deal, and she sings beautifully, and the melodies are good enough. But this is what happened with that music, and I enjoyed the movie completely. The music would just stir your heart, just incredible, just create this tremendous wave of longing or feeling. I mean, it wasn't just her singing, but it was this, the Fiddler on the Roof kind of feeling that you can get when you play that Jewish music in that way. So it was great, like this. But what happened, and this is how it felt to me, you stir up all this motion and it gets pulled. It doesn't like rise up and rest at the spiritual eye. The heart gets stirred up, but it gets stirred up in longing. So it's like from the heart level, and when I talk about the chakras, in the context of the chakras, it's like you magnetize the energy of the chakras, then you lift that energy upward, from the bottom chakras, adding the energy as you rise through, until you bring all that energy to rest at the point between the eyebrows. And then you're in a spirit of elevated consciousness, and all that feeling has been elevated. But what happened with this music is the heart was really stirred, but it was pulled out in this very human experience, human love, human longing, human adventure. So I felt like my heart was riled up, it was pulled out. But then the movie stopped because the movie itself was all about stirring up feeling and pulling out in a human way. It wasn't a movie about deep fulfillment. It was about just what happens with human beings. And so I felt like my energy had been awakened, it had been pulled out of me, and then it was just literally dropped onto the sidewalk. Then there was just no place for it to go. It just went splat like that. And I appreciate, Master said at one point, or that, so many couples, he talked about especially in America, they hear a little romantic music and the next thing you know, they have 3 children and they're struggling to pay the bills, because it just, your energy gets awakened, gets pulled out of you, and whoever or whatever happens to be around you, you attach to that. And that is sort of what happens. He said they hear a little music, they fall into a romantic mood. And the next thing you know. And by contrast, I really thought, especially Swami's songs compared to the songs she was singing, is that his songs can really stir your heart in a tremendous way. But it stirs your heart in such a way that, at least I think, that the energy rises to the spiritual eye. And it doesn't whirl like it did in that movie. The energy just whirls, and it's not an unpleasant feeling, you see. And in fact, a lot of people really like it, because it sort of makes you think that something wonderful is about to happen. And that's why you fall into a romantic mood and think that the person next to you is causing that romantic mood. And it's a pleasurable feeling, it seems at first, to have that energy stirred up and called and promised, and you reach. But it very often doesn't actually turn out that way. You make bad judgments. You are continually being pulled outside of yourself. You're not really directing your energy to the real source of our fulfillment. And this is why Swamiji has always been so careful about the music at Ananda, because what he says is it not only reflects consciousness, it creates consciousness. And he's not being unreasonable. It's that music is sadhana. And if people were innovating Kriya and saying, I just as soon do it this way because that's what I did when I was a child and I enjoyed it, no one would even think about allowing such a thing, because we would expect that the master knew what he was doing. But sometimes people think that music is just arbitrary, but it isn't at all. It's absolutely central to our sadhana. There was a time here when we were doing some sort of circle dancing. We were using some of our songs and we were doing circle dancing, and Swami was a little less than enthusiastic about it. And I said to him, Swamiji, it's not sadhana. We're not doing it in lieu of Kriya. I said, we're doing it instead of going to the movies. It's just like a more wholesome, fun way just to get together. But there's no pretense here that just sort of skipping around in a circle actually is the core of what our teaching is. And he said, well, in that case. Even then he was, for various reasons. We had used some songs that some of the dances we created did not match the music that he had written. And I realized that after the fact. And we sort of started, it never really became a big activity, but we started being more careful about what we were doing. So anyway, let's go on with this. So he says, I've worried about this because emotion at the beginning of a chanting session can be very helpful, but eventually you want that feeling to become calmer and deeper and more interiorized, and how do we accomplish that? Another point, which I think will not be very well received, Swami knew, another point which will not be very well received, but needs to be said. Master never, and Swami puts that in all caps, Master never played Indian chants for group singing. Yeah, Master never played Indian chants. He could easily have sung Maha Mantra, which is Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, etc., or one of the other simple chants we all do. I do know that in recounting the life of Sri Chaitanya, he once sang, Radhe, Radhe, Radhe Govinda Jai, spirit and nature dancing together. But it was usually in the context of that story, and by his translation, he gave it a spiritual meaning. Even in India, Swami says, now Master came to America in 1920. In 1935, he felt Sri Yukteswar calling him back to India, because Sri Yukteswar, in fact, left his body when Master was there. So in 1935, he went back to India for a year and a half, and then came to America again and never returned to India. So Swami says, even in India for that year and a half, the only story I heard of his chanting in a group was of one night when he sang and danced all night. It was in Calcutta. A huge crowd joined him. They filled the house, then the street outside the house, then covered the surrounding roofs. Now that would have been something worth to be part of, wouldn't it? What a glorious evening. They all danced joyfully the whole night. And the chant he sang on that occasion in Bengali was door of my heart. I mean, he put it in their language, but still, door of my heart. In fact, Master brought to the world a whole new style of singing to God. His chants are not, and again Swami puts this in capital letters, are not like traditional Indian chanting. So there are several factors I'd like to consider. Let's begin with the last of them. Master's mission was to spiritualize America and the West, not to Indianize it. Okay, that's, when I first went to Ananda in the early 70s, we were living in an extremely remote way. Very few of us had cars, no television, no internet. If you had a radio, it was a little battery-operated radio. Television, as I said, there was no there. We didn't have much money. We just entertained ourselves right where we were. In my mind, we were very, very Indian. I was living back in some earlier incarnation, that's all. Just some, I know that I've had many incarnations in India and undoubtedly have lived there with Swamiji and ashrams and so on. So it was just this very Indian, in my mind it was Indian. For the early years before they put gravel on the path, they were this very soft red dust in the summer, and we'd walk around barefoot, just walk through the woods barefoot, and in my own mind, my own heart, I was really reliving incarnations in Indian villages. And we wore Indian clothes, and a lot of times, for our dress clothes were Indian clothes, and we had Indian names. It was very much like that. And Swami was closer to his own Indian roots, and even though he did some Indian chants, he also sang Indian devotional songs. Later on, Swami actually repudiated to a certain extent his own affection for India. He makes reference to this obliquely, because it put him out of tune with the West. When he allowed himself to go too much into that Indian bhav, I'll call it, this Indian mood, this devotional mood, he said it was very difficult to live in the West and relate to the West. And he needed to live in the West and relate to the West. So he just sort of pushed it back a little bit. He did that for his own sake, so that he could be more in tune with what he was doing. So that was my own idea. I came to India, to Ananda in 1971. I traveled to India for the first time in 1986, at the very end of 86. So 15 years of that life. And it was very interesting because we traveled on pilgrimage and we went to many holy places throughout India, to the Jagannath temple in Puri, although as Westerners they wouldn't let us in. But we went to Puri, we went to places sacred to Master's life, we went to Varanasi, we went to Rishikesh. Oh, excuse me, maybe we didn't, we went to Darjeeling, but we went to the Ganges, especially in Varanasi. Anyway, it was a very, very glorious trip. I saw lots of Hindu temples and lots of Hindu ceremonies and pujas and aratis and all the things that people do. And I came to a really interesting understanding that what Master taught was about as Hindu as it was Catholic, which is to say, not very. You can see tiny touches of the Catholic kind of devotion to Christ and to the saints in what Master taught. And you can see about that much Hinduism in it. Which is not very much. And so where I thought I was being a Hindu, didn't turn out I was being a Hindu, because I knew I wasn't being a Catholic. And it was perfectly obvious to me that I wasn't being a Hindu either, because I enjoyed what they were doing, but it wasn't what we were doing. It wasn't what we were doing at all, because Master created a new expression. He came to show that the original teachings of Jesus and the original teachings of Krishna are the same truth, but that both what people call the teachings of Krishna, which for convenience we'll call Hinduism, and what they call Christianity, which is the Catholics or whoever you call, neither of those are the same as the original teachings. So Master came to show the original teachings, not the overgrown tree that's come out from it. So we were not Catholic and we were not Hindu, not at all Hindu. So just to pick up, because a lot of us have Indian samskars, and it all feels very familiar and very homey to us. That's how Master felt too. The Indian bhav makes a great deal of sense, but it isn't what Master brought. So even when he was in India, inspiring people, to be so energized with the presence of God, he could have done anything, but instead he sang "Door of My Heart," because he was not trying to reawaken the traditions of India. He was trying to start a brand new tradition, because it's a new expression. Swami said, asked Master, is this a new religion? He said, no, but it is a new expression. It's not a new truth, but it's a new costume for that truth. That's why it's so important. And chanting is the heart of what Master, at the heart of what Master taught. And therefore, everything about it is extremely important. And we can't afford, as Swami says in a few minutes, just to do what we like. So, he said, so there are several factors I'd like to consider. Let's begin with the last of them. Master's mission was to spiritualize America and the West, not to Indianize it. He himself loved Indian music and was exceptionally well versed in the Indian style of playing and singing. Even so, he didn't involve Western audiences in it. And from all I can tell, he even sought to inspire the audiences in India itself with this new style of chanting. Very significant. See how Swamiji tries to work it out. Like, what was Master intending? What can we learn from what he did? How does what he did illustrate a principle? So instead of just saying, well, Master didn't do it, so we won't do it. Swami always tried very hard to show us how to think about these things, so that rather than just retreating into dogmas, which are much easier than actual creative thought, we can actually understand. And when new situations arise that Swami hasn't addressed, because they don't exist until they exist, then we will be able to think, well, how did Swami think about this? He thought about what Master did. He thought about where Master did it. He thought about the options Master might have had, and therefore these were the choices he made. So he even bothers to tell us that Master was expert at Indian-style singing, very well-trained and very good at it. So his decision not to focus on that style of music was not based on any inability on his part to do it. Because after all, he was raised there, and he probably also really enjoyed it. He had a collection of Indian music that he would listen to on recordings. Okay, so does this mean we should give up the Indian chants altogether, because this is the fulcrum issue here? No, I don't think so. There is much more exposure to Indian culture nowadays than there was in Master's time. He himself would sometimes sing Indian songs for us in the Indian manner. Tagore's songs and others. I have a CD Agni made for me from Indian records that Master loved. So Master set the example that there's nothing wrong with this music. And he sang the devotional songs which Swami sang for many years too. Not chants, but long devotional songs. But Master didn't sing those chants that recite all those names of deities. Even when singing to Radha and Krishna, he universalized the concept by his translations, spirit and nature dancing together. Still, some of the Indian chants are beautiful. I'd be sorry to give them up, and I don't think I'm intruding a merely personal preference in saying so. I simply don't think that basically this is what we either want or need. Swami himself, on one of the early, in fact the first chanting album he did at Ananda, he includes at least one, maybe more than one, Indian chant. So he used to sing them, some of them too. At the same time, I don't think the mere fact that a chant is Indian is sufficient reason for singing it. Many of those Indian chants are neither beautiful nor inspiring. They haven't a good melody. They produce a lot of noise, but no deep feeling. I think we need to be more selective in the chants we use, and especially to sing those with real beauty, rather than select them merely for their Indianness. And I really think we shouldn't sing so many of them. We are the disciples of a new ray, and within that ray, a new kind of music has been produced. I think we should honor this fact and emphasize it more. The next point has to do with emotionalism. So, that was all that I was saying, that this is a different ray. This is the language of this ray. Attunement with this ray is vital to our discipleship. So, the next point has to do with emotionalism. Most Ananda members were raised on emotional music, so it comes naturally. I had my own share of this exposure too, though later in my boyhood, and it never really sank in because I didn't particularly enjoy it. Nevertheless, there is bound to be a tendency to like sounds that remind us of the music we grew up with, and this means liking and then wanting the emotional side of chanting and singing. This is such a hard issue. It's just, let me think about this for a minute. Our whole culture is just so emotional. All of our music, all of our stories, it's just that all this falling in love and living happily ever after, and we have I'm talking about the USA right at the moment. We have no context. You have to have a multi-generational family even that's actively connected is not that common. To have a multi-generational household is exceedingly rare. Most people grow up in a nuclear family situation. Nowadays, with so much divorce and separation, you often never really see, even in your own household, a marriage that's functional. When I grew up, divorce was much less common, but at most you saw your parents and maybe one or two other couples, parents of your friends, or maybe you had a few relatives. But most of people's understanding of romance is from music, novels, and movies. And now I would add television to that. It wasn't so much when I was growing up. What all of them have in common is they're made up. Especially novels, movies, and television shows. The nature of those is the word fiction. That's what they are. They're just made up. Somebody makes up a story. And they make up a story that's going to be popular and what's going to be popular is emotion. Just like Yentl, where the heart is really activated and it's pulled out of itself in longing with the promise that you can have that. And so people really just grow up thinking that fiction is actually real life. I actually had someone once say to me, she told me that she was really looking for the perfect romance and she wanted her romance to be just like, and then she named this movie. Just gave me the name of a movie, which, it was a hard moment for me. because it was a preposterous movie. The whole premise of the movie was preposterous, even though it was put forward as if it were a real story. I mean, you know, the foundation of this relationship that she wanted to base her life on was trivial beyond human comprehension. It was wildly, wildly improbable and impossible. And yet this poor woman was sitting there wanting to base her life on it. And it was just stir up the heart, drag it out in some false promise of fulfillment, and then you're down the rabbit hole. I mean, I'm a deep believer in human love. I think love and friendship and the devotion that human beings have for each other, it's extraordinary. Swamiji was an extraordinary loving friend to people. I'm not speaking romance. I'm just saying true love, true friendship. You can hear it in his songs. His songs are just filled with longing and fulfillment. But it's real longing and it's real fulfillment. It's not fiction. At the end of hearing Swami's music, you feel elevated and interiorized instead of stirred up and dropped on the sidewalk. So this inclination for emotionalism, we don't even think of it as anything. We just think of it as music. And we're very comfortable with it and we're used to it. And it comes naturally to us. We go there much more easily. We know how to go there. I found it, I don't know if it was in this class or a different one that I was talking about when the school play that we did this year was on the book of Esther. And the book of Esther from the Old Testament, and Esther is one of the great heroines of Judaism because she saved her people. The evil prime minister had tricked the king into issuing an edict to exterminate the Jewish people, and Esther bravely faced up to the king and his evil prime minister, and she saved her people. It's a great story, and so we actually did it as a film because we couldn't do it as a performance because of the pandemic this year. But part of it is they did these Hebrew songs from my childhood, and of course they have there's a certain heart energy. It's very familiar to me. And it was very amazing to me how easily, as soon as that music would start, I would hear it. All of this energy would start moving through me. And it was emotional. I was going to say, I think there were songs, the Hebrew words were more about God, but they weren't devotional chants, they were just Hebrew words. But as soon as I would hear them, this feeling of familiarity would come to me. And if I'm repeating this, forgive me, but I'd also recently seen a documentary about the Black Church by this Professor Gates, I think his name is. And he's a Harvard professor, a very high-level person in the world. And he grew up in what he calls the Black Church. And when he was hosting this documentary, as soon as they would start singing the spirituals that were part of his childhood or preaching in that particular characteristic way, I saw him do exactly what I did when I heard the Hebrew songs. It's very emotional. It's lovely music. I mean, that music is to God, but it's emotional. There's no way you can not say that it's not. And I just saw him fall right into it, just totally fall right into it. And then I watched myself fall right into it. So those happen to be spiritually based traditions, but it's still very, very emotional, even though you're singing about Jesus or you're singing about Hero Israel, whatever it might be. But it's familiar, it's what we're used to, it's what we think of as desirable. So, sadhana is not just doing what you always did and calling it spiritual. Sadhana is actually transforming and redirecting your energy. So the mere fact that something comes naturally to you we shouldn't always be suspicious of everything that comes naturally to us, but just because it comes naturally to us does not necessarily mean it's going to help our sadhana. I mean, that's the question. Will it help our sadhana? I remember there was a romance in the community, and the man eventually married the woman, and she didn't want to be at Ananda, so he left with her. I saw him 30 years later. He came to our church. They'd had 5 children. He'd had a very successful career, but he didn't have the light in his eyes that he'd had at the beginning. And when they were getting together, Swamiji said, because the man was a real deep devotee. Swami said, she's a nice woman, but she won't help his sadhana. That's how he put it. She won't help his sadhana. And he tried to, Swami himself never directly said anything, but he tried through some of us to try to get the man to consider that fact. But he was enamored, and karma takes you. Because that's how we're trained. You know, we have to learn how to perceive that which really helps our sadhana, because the mere fact that it stirs the heart, it may not be stirring the heart in the right direction. Now, I'm not trying to make anyone paranoid, but I am trying to say these are very real things, and we have to pay attention to them if we're serious as devotees, or at least we have to learn from our experiences. Pay attention and have the courage to learn. So let's go to where we are. The next point has to do with emotionalism. Most Ananda members were raised on emotional music, so it comes naturally. And there he's saying, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. Nevertheless, there's a tendency to like sounds that remind us of what we grew up with. That means liking and then wanting. The emotional side of chanting and singing. So that's where I took off a moment ago. It's natural to like the things that remind us. I rarely went to synagogue or temple, but I actually went to summer camp for like 10 years. And it was a Jewish summer camp, and we sang all these songs and danced and did all of that. So it actually went pretty deep in me. It was very odd. I only remembered recently that it was summer camp that gave this to me. Swami says, I worry about this fact of people liking and then wanting more emotionalism in our chanting and singing. I worry about this fact because music is so much more than entertainment. And that's so important. It doesn't merely reflect a state of consciousness, it also generates it. So doesn't just reflect consciousness, it also creates it. A taste for emotional music, if it is too much encouraged, will almost certainly change Ananda's very state of consciousness. In time, it will change Ananda's underlying vibration. Swamiji, I want to see something. Swamiji had a way of seeing in even small actions and decisions. He said it himself. He said, there can be a decision made that everybody else thinks is just fine, but Swami can see like 20 years down the way that if we actually make this decision in this way, then this is where we're going to end up. And it's part of his extraordinary skill as a leader is that he can feel the very long-range implications of things. So whereas we might think, but Swami, we like doing this, it's fun, it makes us feel good, he will know that if we allow that inclination toward emotionalism in our music, it will gradually change what Ananda is. And he has earned the right to say that. So, there are three ways of expressing emotions musically: through melody, chords, and rhythm. Of course, Swami himself is such a sensitive musician, so he's explaining some things to us. Even an uplifting melody can be dragged down by chords that are too emotional and by a heavy rhythm. Chords, if too heavily emphasized, can keep music on an emotional level, and too heavy a downbeat in the strumming of the guitars will also emphasize the emotions and feelings that strengthen the ego with their implied affirmation. I want, I like, I don't like. That's the rhythm that just pounds and the guitar that hits too heavy. So, another aspect of the chords, as many people play them, another aspect of the chords, as many people play them, I confess, distressed me. For there are right chords and wrong ones. Too often I found myself cringing every time a wrong chord is repeated in a chant. If this musical outrage doesn't disturb everyone, I still don't think it can actually inspire anyone. There's a reason why certain chords are right and why certain others wrong. Music is a language. It isn't simply a production of sounds. Swami often says that very clearly. He says music is a language as precise as any other language. So if in the middle of my talking to you, I listen like that, you would know that something went wrong with what I was trying to communicate. Because we speak English. If I spoke a second language and could have, lapsed into Spanish or German and you didn't speak that, then you would realize that something had gone wrong in what I was trying to say. Swami has emphasized to us all the time that music is a language as precise as any other. So if you're just playing along, and now I can't claim, although if I listen carefully I can often, but I'm not trained and I'm not capable of hearing it the way Swami hears it at all, although usually when it's pointed out to me I can. I'm just trying to not sell myself short in saying this. But if it's a chord, if it's a combination of notes that leads the energy away from where the song is trying to go, it's just like just dissolving into gibberish or suddenly starting to shout about something that is completely unrelated to what we're trying to do. Now, the mere fact that not everybody can tell or can tell why something is wrong doesn't mean that it's not wrong. Okay? It's like when Swami speaks Italian, I can't tell whether his grammar is correct. I can't tell what his words are. But someone who knows Italian knows whether he's saying what he needs to say. And so someone who knows music knows whether it's become gibberish or not, or become misleading. Somebody can talk about the same subjects I talk about and nuance it slightly differently. I'll use that as a good example. And nuance it slightly differently, and others might not know it. I'll give you an example of that, and then I'm going to stop for the evening. Once, many, many years ago, there was this very well-known Indian woman teacher, and I happened to be in Southern California. I think I must have been on a lecture tour. I don't think I wasn't vacationing there. And she was giving a satsang, and I was intrigued, and so I just decided to go and see her. And she was very popular. She had hundreds of followers. It was this huge auditorium, and it was very Indian. The women were on, no, is that true? The women on one side? Yeah, conceivably, yes. I think the women were on one side and the men on the other, although I'm not certain. It's unimportant. Pause for a minute. But I think that was so. And then we were there for the whole satsang was 3.5 hours or something. But the guru herself did not come out for at least a full hour. And there was some chanting during that time, which was awful, but that was beside the point. And the point that I'm making here. But then some of her disciples came out and they told stories. So this was supposed to be inspiring and entertaining for us. And they told, she was a remarkable woman, she's still around somewhere. And so they were telling these stories, these very unusual stories that they had, the experiences they had with her, semi-miraculous or phenomenal or really meaningful, dramatic things that happened in their own lives. 3 or 4 people told stories. The stories were well told, they were very entertaining, they were extremely interesting, all of that. Not one of them took that specific incident and drew out a principle from it. Whenever Swami talks about Master, and I hope whenever I talk about Swami, because I really try to follow it, we try to elevate it to a principle. Because if it's a principle, then the fact that this person had the experience, I can still learn the lesson. And so when I hear them talk, when I hear Swami talk about Master, it takes me somewhere. It's like, oh, I understand. Oh, that's what it means. Oh, Swami's very sensitive to this music. Oh, Swami has an understanding of the direction that's being set. So he's very attentive right now because of the direction being set. Oh, Master, even when he was in India, he didn't use these Indian chants. So he could have, because he knew about it. So there's more that's involved every time. These people just told the stories. It was perfectly well-meaning. The net result of it was, this is exactly what happened. Now, of course, I don't belong to that path. But all I could think of was how lucky they were to have those experiences. I'll never get to have experiences like that. Because there was nothing universalized around it. It was just how extraordinary she was and what a weird experience or interesting or odd or glorious experience they had. You're so lucky, I'm left out. Now what I'm saying is, language is precise. Now, most of the people would not have necessarily thought that, but because I have been very carefully trained by Swamiji, especially in that one specific thing, which is not to make a personality cult, but to show how this person exemplifies the principles we're all trying to live and can live. And from their example, we'll know what to do. Because I know the language. And so that's what, I'm using that as a specific because I can relate to it, but I don't think anybody else in the room even thought about it. So we hear somebody chanting or playing in a certain rhythm or doing it in a certain way, and we think it's fine because we don't know the language. Swami knows the language. He knows that this chant is meant to say this, and if you start saying this with it, then we've abandoned something that has been given to us specifically for our sadhana, specifically to take us into a certain vibration, and we've changed it into another meaning. And it's not acceptable, or let me phrase it differently, it's not wise if we really want to be in tune with Master as disciples. So we're halfway through that letter, or a little more than half, and next time we meet, we'll finish. God bless you, my friends.